I'm Alex Vissink, a historian specialized in the Viking Age. When we think about Old Norse religion, the image is usually clear. Odin as the Allfather, ruling over a unified pantheon in Asgard. Other gods and goddesses, such as Thor and Freyr, stand at his side. The gods form a structured divine family. It is a compelling image, but it is also quite possibly misleading. In today's video, I want to explore an article by Terry Gunnel called Pantheon, What Pantheon? And explore a simple but important historical argument that not all medieval Scandinavians, and hence also not all the participants in Viking activity overseas, believed in Odin as a supreme universal deity. Once we examine the sources carefully, the idea of a single unified Norse pantheon begins to look far less certain than modern imagination suggests. First, we go over the most important content of the article by Terry Gunnel, and afterwards I'll be looking into some contemporary early medieval Christian sources. So much of what we think we know about Norse mythology comes from one individual, namely Snorri Sturluson, writing in the early 13th century. His work, called the Prose Edda, presents a remarkably structured cosmos, with Odin as the Allfather, a divine hierarchy, the Aesir and the Vanir as organized groups, and a coherent mythic narrative from the creation to Ragnarok, the end of the world. The problem with this as a historical foundation is chronological but also cultural. Snorri was writing more than 200 years after Iceland converted to Christianity. His aim was not to document living religion, but to preserve poetic traditions and explain older skaldic verse. He systemized myth in a way that made it internally coherent, arguably more coherent than pre-Christian belief or Norse religion ever was. As historians, we must distinguish very carefully between medieval literary reconstruction and Viking Age religious practice. One additional complication deserves mention, or other major poetic source, the Poetic Edda, survives primarily in a manuscript known as the Codex Regius, which is written in the 13th century also. And although many of the poems are linguistically older than that, they too were preserved in a Christian cultural context, which we must be aware of. The scribes who copied them were not pagan priests preserving doctrine, they were Christian intellectuals preserving cultural heritage. What survives, therefore, seems not to be a transparent window into Old Norse religion. One could ask, was there one Old Norse religion? For a long time, scholars spoke confidently of Old Norse religion as if it were a unified, stable system shared across the totality of Scandinavia. However, over the past few decades, that assumption has been increasingly challenged. Pre-Christian Scandinavia was not politically unified, it was not culturally unified, it was also not religiously centralized. So beliefs likely varied by region, social group, environment, and historical period. For instance, the religious world of a coastal Norwegian farmer in the 9th century may have looked quite different than that of a Swedish warrior attached to a royal court in the 10th century. So in short, instead of one religion, we may be dealing with overlapping religious systems. So one thing that Terry Gunnel points out is that if Odin truly functioned as the universally acknowledged supreme god, we might expect his presence to dominate the landscape, especially in place names, for instance. Yet the evidence suggests something else. In Iceland and in large parts of Western Norway, place names overwhelmingly favor Thor. Freyr also appears prominently in certain regions. Odin, however, is comparatively sparse. Also, archaeology seems to support this uneven picture. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, for instance, the Mjolnir, are found in large numbers across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. They appear in graves, settlements, and hoards. And by contrast, material objects clearly linked to Odin are much more rare and often ambiguous. Again, this does not prove that Thor was more important than Odin everywhere, but it does suggest that devotion to Thor operated at a broad social level, extending well beyond elite circles. So where does the prominence of Odin come from? From the 6th century onward, parts of Scandinavia saw the development of large central halls and emerging regional rulers. These were increasingly militarized societies. And it was within these contexts that attributes and characteristics of Odin were powerful. So he was a god of war, he was a patron of poetry, a master of magic, and also the receiver of the slain in Valhalla. It is also this ideology of Valhalla, a hall for fallen warriors, that aligns closely with elite military culture. Skalds, court poets attached to rulers, preserved and transmitted many of the Odin-centered myths. The surviving poetic corpus therefore reflects elite ideology more than everyday rural belief. However, for everyday farming communities concerned with weather, livestock, and stability, a god like Thor or Freyr may have felt more immediately relevant. In many regions, it seems that Thor appears not as a secondary figure under Odin, but as a central and supreme deity. So, for instance, in some traditions, Freyr is even described as the god of the world. Important to mention is that these gods were not, or seem not to have been narrowly specialized. A single deity could plausibly cover multiple different domains. This challenges older models that rigidly divide gods into fixed social functions. So rather than imagining every medieval Scandinavian worshipping a full pantheon organized under Odin, it may be more accurate to think in terms of henotheism. Henotheism means primary devotion to one principal god without denying the existence of other gods. For instance, a community in Iceland might primarily worship Thor, a Swedish royal house might emphasize Freyr, a warrior retinue might elevate Odin as the supreme god. These are all possibilities within the system of henotheism. Also, other gods were known, but they were not necessarily central to daily religious life. Then we move over from more of the observations of Terry Gunnel to contemporary early medieval Christian sources. There's one early medieval Christian source, the Vita Anskarii, that seems to provide evidence that early medieval Scandinavians could recognize the power of one god while still acknowledging others. So a pattern consistent with henotheism. In a future video, I will elaborate even more on the Vita Anskarii as a work. The author of the Vita Anskarii describes scenarios in which people consulted both their traditional gods and also the Christian god, weighing their relative power in specific situations. For example, during an attack on a town by Swedish warriors, lots were cast, and it is said that lots were cast and it was found that Christ was willing to help them. When this had been publicly notified, the hearts of all were forthwith so greatly encouraged that they wished to proceed immediately to make a bold attack on the town. Later, reflecting on the same events, the Swedish army acknowledged the Christian god as the most effective or strongest deity in that specific context. So they said, "What," said they, "have we now to fear or dread? Christ is with us. Let us fight and behave like men. Nothing can withstand us, nor shall we fail to secure certain victory, for we have the mightiest of the gods as our helper." Similarly, the Swedish king Anundus is reported to have recognized Christ as the strongest god while still acknowledging other gods. According to the author of the Vita Anskarii, King Anundus has said, "There are there," so in Birka, he said, "many great and powerful gods, and in the former time a church, and there were many Christians there to worship Christ, who is the strongest of the gods and can aid those who hope in him." Obviously, and this is very important to mention, we are dealing here with a Christian source that aims to underline the power of the Christian God. So in reality, Christianity may not have been so widely spread or successfully adopted at the time. Yet, reading between the lines, Rembertus, the author of the Vita Anskarii, consistently depicts a situation in which devotion could focus on one god without denying other gods, a pattern corresponding with Henotheism. Also, there seems not to have been a apparent reason for him to fabricate such a subtle acknowledgement of the continued relevance of multiple gods. It seems highly plausible that he is reflecting part of the reality of religious practice in medieval Scandinavia, even while framing it through a Christian lens. As such, these passages, this work seems to provide independent support for the argument that early Scandinavians and early Scandinavian religious life often involved selective, context-dependent devotion. And these passages also illustrate a selective situational recognition of divine power. Devotion could focus on a single god without necessarily abandoning others, a clear example of henotheism. This mirrors the patterns seen in Old Norse religion, as we've discussed earlier, where communities might emphasize Thor, Freyr, or Odin, depending on local needs, social context, or preference. So, in conclusion, the Odin-centered pantheon described by Snorri Sturluson might represent one strand of belief, but it's definitely not a universal worldview that everyone adhered to in medieval Scandinavia. The evidence and also the account of Rembertus, the Vita Anskarii, seems to suggest that henotheism or system of henotheism was most common in medieval Scandinavia during the Viking Age. That is the elevation of one deity in practice without excluding other gods. So in other words, one god could be treated as the strongest without necessarily denying the existence of other gods. So when we return to the question and ask whether all medieval Scandinavians, and hence also Scandinavians involved in Viking activity, believed in Odin, the answer is no, most likely. Some did, others centered their devotion on Thor, Freyr, other local powers, or in certain contexts, even Christ. An important point to take away from this video is that Old Norse religion was not something that was uniform. It was diverse, situational, and constantly evolving. Thank you all once again for watching. Make sure to read the article by Terry Gunnel yourself if you have the chance, and see you all in another video.